Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective, and I hope everybody's having a good Friday. Today, this is Easter weekend upon us, and we will be talking about Jesus Christ and other things. Now, we've got a guy with us. He's a philosopher. He is all around very knowledgeable, and he knows his history. So let's find out, really, what is the story of Easter? Does it have something to do with Jesus? Like, what exactly are the facts? And what exactly are not the facts? Please welcome Jason Rheins.
Hi, thanks for having me. I know I say this pretty often, but this is not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is philosophy and the history of philosophy, especially ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. So I do have some background in some biblical studies stuff, but at the level of we're going to talk, I should say that I'm sort of a scholar in adjacent areas, and I have some sort of amateur hobbyist kind of interest, but I mostly have to rely on the work of other scholars. I can read the texts and things in the languages, but so I just want to clarify that. Like, if we're talking about Plato, if we're talking about metaphysics, if we're talking about objectivism stuff, like I'm really in my domain here. I have to stretch a little. So that's the caveat.
Yeah, well, thank you for mentioning that. Different people on the show, like different hosts have a different approach. Like I know like Nikos is really big on like reading a book before he'll talk about its author. Whereas people like me and Mark Pellegrino are more like fly on the wall type of attitude. Like we're having a conversation and we're pulling from whatever it is we have thought about and studied and just kind of seeing where the conversation goes. So yeah, but I mean, since I do keep introducing you as sort of an expert type of figure, I guess it is good that you're mentioning your expertise is not necessarily in the topic that we're talking about today. Now, here's what I know about Good Friday. I first heard about it as a teenager. My upbringing was not Christian at all. So I first heard of Good Friday and all of that when my band was playing at we got a gig at like a Christian type of youth event taking place somewhere in the deep suburbs of Michigan, Metro Detroit. We were like kind of a rebellious type of punk metal type of band, and there was kind of layers of irony. Like I thought we were going to upset them, like we were going to piss them off playing American Jesus and all this stuff. But really, the joke was on me. They didn't care. They were just happy to have the kids there. Learning about Jesus and having a good time. They know the long game. They know about how to live offensively for God is the way. But
I didn't know you were in a punk band. That's awesome.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we had a lot of fun.
We've never talked about punk rock music.
Oh, we should do an episode about that. Is that something you're into?
Yeah, but like purely as a personal love, like not like I know so like there's a way in which I know very little, but I just really like it and have listened to it for a long time.
I think we should definitely do an episode about punk and rock and punk rock and relate it to, aesthetics, and at some point relate it back to, the objectivist view of art and all that. But yeah, let's bookmark that if you're agreeable.
Yeah.
But so at this particular event, the Christian youth thing, as it was before it was time for us to play, I wandered into the sermon where, the youth Pastor Dan, was speaking to a room of teenagers. And the first thing I hear when I step in is, and then Jesus said, "I'm thirsty." And
Jesus, hashtag Jesus so thirsty.
Right, Jesus thirst. And then the next thing the only other thing I remember from this sermon was at the end, one of the kids raised his hand and said, "Why do we call it Good Friday? Isn't it Bad Friday? I mean, Jesus was tortured and hurt." And Pastor Dan said, he thought about it and he said, no, it is Good Friday, because if Jesus hadn't been tortured that way, we would all be slaves and dead, he added. And so I guess my first question is, to your knowledge, is the Christian view that if Jesus had not been tortured the way he was, we would all be simultaneously slaves and dead?
If you mean like slaves to sin, and
Or to the
dead in the
devil?
sense of our death would be final, there would be no return to life or no life everlasting, then yeah, in most Christian soteriology, which is like the view of salvation, theory of salvation, um, Jesus's sacrifice, or God's sacrifice of Jesus, is necessary for the redemption of mankind, particularly because of the fact of original sin. Um, it's not always exactly like that, but the typical picture is that that both Jesus's death as a man and resurrection, and sometimes also just the mere fact that Jesus, as a part of God, was sent down to earth in the first place, is necessary for this special salvation that is not possible otherwise. Even with the Mosaic law, is not fully possible.
Mm-hmm. I took the pastor's words to mean that like basically God was going to punish everyone for being sinners. Like we were all basically going to live under we were all going to basically be born into hell. Like we would all just be in hell all the time, slaves to Satan and to his friends, I guess. And like life was going to be just a perpetual nightmare with no chance at redemption. But then Jesus said, take me, like let me suffer for their sins, and then we have a chance to live and to enjoy life, and then ultimately give ourselves to God. That's how I kind of that's what I took his words to imply.
I mean, I don't. As far as I know, the mainstream kind of view is not mainstream Christian kind of view is not that God sort of plans or intends for everybody to be lost to perdition, and then Jesus says, "No, no, let me, I'll take the ring," like or something like that. But rather that God always intended, or because God has always intended everything God does, because He's outside of time, and intended Jesus to be sort of part of this whole arc. Uh, but at the same time, there are ways in which historically Christians have sort of seen the sacrifice of Jesus as revising the covenant that God had previously made with Abraham. And some people kind of particular see a sort of parallelism between some early Christians see a parallelism, especially between the binding of Isaac, the Akedat Yitzchak, where Abraham is prepared to sacrifice his son, or even him sending off his other son, and Ishmael, and on the one hand, and God sacrificing his son when He makes a kind of new covenant. But the kind of what's I guess become more or less the kind of orthodox view, or at least an important view through Catholicism, although there are philosophical differences even within the Catholic or Eastern Orthodox tradition here, is that sin is inescapable, but grace is irresistible. So as a human being, you are born with sin, except in a miraculous case like Mary, where she's conceived and born without sin. And that there's nothing you can do about that. But if God chooses to give you grace, you will be saved because of the sacrifice of Jesus, which is the price that had to be paid to effectively buy that salvation for those who receive it. And that makes Jesus a play the role of a sacrificial lamb, or oh God, what's it called? The scapegoat. The scapegoat, as it originally functioned, this sort of goat that had to die for the sins of Israel. And you would kind of just transfer your sins onto the goat, and then the goat, it dies for its sins. So Jesus effectively is sort of this scapegoat, as it were, for the world.
Mary had no sin. Is that
the miraculous conception is not the conception of Jesus by God in a Mary who is a virgin, but rather the conception, the immaculate conception is the conception of Mary immaculate, that is without stain.
And so she's generally without sin.
She's born without the stain of original sin. Yeah. She needs that. That's necessary for her to be, as it were, like an acceptable vessel for God.
Why was she born without sin? I guess I can't, you don't know. Nobody knows why Mary, right? Like why was she born sinless while everyone else is born guilty?
I mean, because God made it that way, which presumably means he could make the rest of us that way too. Why not?
Yeah.
But her, in some of the non-canonical gospels, we hear about the background of her parents, Anna, and I'm trying to remember her father's name, Joachim, and they are righteous before God. A third of their wealth they give all to the temple and the priests, a third to the poor and needy, and 1/3 they use just for their needs and live on. Anna is a descendant of the house of David from Bethlehem, and Joachim is of Nazareth, which is in the Galilee. And in this story, Mary spends, in this story, which is an adaptation of, especially an adaptation of the story of Samuel, from the beginning of Samuel. They have been married, Joachim and Anna, for 20 years. Joachim goes to the temple to make an offering on one of the three pilgrimage holidays, like Passover, which is also beginning this week. And he's mocked by the priest. The priest says, you're sonless, and the scripture says, "Cursed be he who does not beget a son in Israel." And you have not begotten a son, or any child for that matter. Clearly, Yahweh doesn't think well of you, since he's done this to you. And so you're not fit to make an offering. And so his offering is rejected. And then an angel appears and tells him that, this happened to Abraham and Sarah. She was 80 years old, and then God gave them Isaac. This happened in the case of Samson. This happened in the case of Samuel. I should add, Joachim and Anna say, like, if God, if you'll give us a child, we will devote him to your temple, which is what happens in the case of Samuel. And so the angel says, like, this is perfectly parallel to those Jewish stories, And so in fact, the angel says, when God makes somebody barren, it's so that if he decides later to give them a child, like he reserves the right to kind of give them a child later, miraculously. And that's to show that, like, children are begotten not from lust, but from a gift of God. And so they get married, they have a daughter, and the angel told them, they devote her to a temple. and she lives in the temple and is raised like sealed off from any sin of the world until she's 12. And at the time that she's 12, she's hitting puberty, which means that she'll begin to have her period. And of course, menstruation blood is considered unclean in Levitical law, Jewish priestly law. And so she now has to be married, and now they have to send her away. And they decide, all right, we'll betroth her to this guy, Joseph, from her hometown of Nazareth, or from her parents' hometown of Nazareth. And that's how that goes. So that's how Mary, at least according to this non-canonical gospel, came to be and was raised both by righteous parents as a gift from God when they were childless, and then was raised in isolation from sin in the temple until an age when when she had to be sent away.
So non-canonical gospel means it was not published in the actual Bible, like it was just a
it
story.
didn't become part of the sort of official collection, but that doesn't mean that. So, but many church fathers accepted it, or took it seriously. So the reason we have so much of this is we have it from Saint Jerome. We have his version, and there were other versions we know of because other church fathers talk about it and mention conflicting details from it. But there are like 20. So we know of at least 40 gospels that, and only 4 are canonical, and we have like 20 of those, or parts of them at least. And so there are ones about Jesus's childhood, the infant gospels. Those are super fun and funny. It's just like Jesus running around as a little kid doing weird stuff,
like miracles. You mean?
Yeah, like there's one where he and his brother are sort of playing, and his brother keeps hitting a lizard with a rock, and then Jesus brings it back to life, and then the kid hits it, and they just keep doing this.
Now, that's way cooler than some other story. I mean, yeah, most of the stories surrounding Jesus I've heard are just preachy and or like graphically violent. But here's sounds like there's a great kids show, like a morning cartoon that could have been made out of the young Jesus the kid. Now Simon in the super chat asks, where does the virgin birth story come from? Mesopotamia?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, it must be Mesopotamian in a sense, right? Like it's that's where Mesopotamia is specifically sort of Iraq. I don't know. I'll be honest. I don't know. You get plenty. There are lots of miraculous birth stories and myths, but there are plenty of stories where a god fathers a child on a married woman, and you sort of have double parentage, double paternity, like the king that this queen is married to is sort of the dad, but Zeus is also sort of the dad, and like with Joseph and God for Jesus. So that part, like, you have already, but the idea that there was no sex, that's weird, or that's unusual. I don't know, but it's unprecedented. Like, I don't know, but there aren't earlier myths like that. But none are jumping to mind. There may be.
Okay, now, so Mary being without sin, also it includes the fact that she felt no temptation, because temptation is a sin. Is that a fair inference?
That is a good. I suppose so. I mean that. That stands to reason, but I'm not sure that's a specifically explicit doctrine in any texts.
Is it? I know stands to reason is a popular sort of cliche. Would it make more sense to say it stands to logic, because reason obviously conflicts? I mean, and I know I'm not trying to be pedantic, but is logic. I'm trying to exercise my own vocabulary here. Logic would be, in the Christian context, Mary felt no temptation. That stands to logic, right? Reason is something that starts with sense perception and all of that. You see what I'm asking?
I mean, I don't make that kind of distinction per se between like reason and logic. But I see your point. I mean, it's in the context of these doctrines, one might infer that. But that's not like something that makes any sense outside of these doctrines and stories. I mean,
now, right. So, is the objectivist view that if you're tempted to the irrational, if you're tempted to do something that's harmful to yourself in the long run, if you're tempted to steal, if you're tempted to do something immoral, that you've made a mistake, that like you psychologically, like you've got some premise that you haven't identified, like is there some sort of like vague, almost parallel?
No, I mean,
no.
Thoughts are not crimes. But not refusing to look at your own thoughts is dangerous. So if you, and emotions come automatically. So if you want something and then upon reflection, you realize that's not a good thing to want, you haven't done anything wrong. You might question why you want that. Sometimes you might want something just because you haven't fully thought through the implications of having it or having it in a certain way. So, for example, a child sees something they want, they might think about stealing something, and the child doesn't understand the implications, say, of what that means to have it by stealing, the dangers involved, something like that. They see it, they reasonably want it, they don't, and they're not, they have to be taught not to do that, and they should be taught why you shouldn't obtain things in this way, and why it's not good. Things had in this way are no longer good. But I think the wanting it isn't I don't know, isn't sinful or something like that. It's our emotions happen sort of automatically. Now, some emotions can come from bad premises, bad values that we have, and those I think should be reflected on, investigated. But in general, I think you torture yourself when you become the kind of inquisitor of your own, like the secret police interrogating your own thought. Like you should question them, you should look for them, but you shouldn't. But religion can teach a certain kind of self-censorship, especially if you think God hears your thoughts. And then you literally, you have to be able to think through things, even things that turn out to be wrong, because we all think things that are wrong at some point, and then we have to reflect on them.
So a student of objectivism might end up adopting guilt for his temptation, for what he wants, feeling like I shouldn't want this, I shouldn't feel a desire for this. And that's kind of maybe an influence of religion or something.
Yeah. Maybe you shouldn't want that. That doesn't mean that, but you do. Okay, do something about it. But don't then beat yourself up for the fact that you do. You're doing what you can about it, right?
Yeah, all you can do is analyze it, think about it, try to understand it, and then hold it up to reality and see if it's
those are the cognitive components, and the behavioral components are to start doing something that replaces it with some other value or some other underlying value, so that you feel differently.
Okay, so back to Jesus now. He's he's basically told by God, you are the chosen one at some point.
So there's the Annunciation, where an angel, traditionally Raphael, I believe, no, maybe Gabriel, doesn't matter, announces that Mary will be carrying the Son of God. That then there is, the Magi, sort of show up once he's born to honor him. But there is also at the moment of his baptism in the River Jordan by John the Baptist, there is a kind of voice from the heavens that says, like, this is my, only begotten son, or like, and so that moment is also kind of pivotal. Now there was a branch of there was a flavor of Christianity that was much more popular in ancient times, but it was eventually kind of more and more driven out. It was called adoptionist. And the adoptionist said, okay, Jesus wasn't born God. Jesus was born a man. He was adopted by God and then became divine, became God's son. And in the ancient Roman world, adoption was very, very common as a kind of model. So like Caesar adopts you, now you're Caesar's kid. Like, so if you look at it like the early Roman emperors, none of them are actually the natural son of the previous emperor. Tiberius was the son-in-law of a stepson of Augustus, but and Nero was a stepson of Claudius, but they get adopted by the previous Caesar and then legally become their son. So that was just a common way of thinking about things. And so many in the adoptionist models, at that moment, typically of Jesus' baptism, that's where God adopts him. And he's like formally declaring, yep, now he's my son. But proto-Orthodox, which then became Orthodox Christianity, wanted to say he was always God and always man, and so he didn't have to be adopted.
Okay, and I read some of the New Testament way back in the day. Satan tries to make an offer to Jesus, at least in one of the books of the New Testament, saying like, here's all I'll give you. I'll give you this castle. I'll give you all these riches. I don't know what riches are even worth when you're already like immortal and it just, why was Jesus thirsty, by the way? It's like, what do you need water for when you can already walk on water and turn it into wine? But I digress. Satan tries to tempt Jesus. He tries to offer Jesus, like, come with me, almost like Darth Vader, we will rule the galaxy together, come with me. But Jesus, of course, wants no part of that. He is
and says my favorite line from the Gospels, which is, what profited a man if he gained the whole world and lose his soul?
That's, I mean, yeah, I think there's something we can abstract from that attitude. Almost like what good is money with nothing to buy, but really just the line itself about what good is any of it without a soul, I think itself is useful in life. Okay, so then I know we probably won't have time for the full story, but at some point Jesus he throws a tantrum in the garden outside the temple, saying, stop doing business here near the house of God, and a little bit of anti-capitalism there, you think, a little bit of anti-business attitude?
There's different bits. So like he overturns the tables of the money lenders. He throws a guy down the stairs, which if you've ever been to the old city in Jerusalem, you know that those stairs are incredibly steep and that guy is dead. We don't actually have the temple steps, but other steps of that kind from that era, like it's dangerous. He curses a fig tree at one point, depending on the different gospels. But yeah, there's some of that. Anyway, Yeah, I mean, money lenders are at the temple because people come to make sacrifices and they have to make certain exchanges for them to be clean and things like it. They actually serve a kind of function in the operation of the temple. It's not just like the temple was. I mean, it's not like Caligula who set up a brothel in the imperial palace, right? Like, no, it's not like that. It's like they're actually serving part of the temple function.
But not according to Jesus. He thinks this is a desecration. Is that
Yeah, I guess
right?
so. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it depends. So the Gospels have different sort of views when it comes to the the laws of Moses and Jewish practice. So, for example, the Gospel, the so-called Matthew Gospel, is basically says Jesus says, I'm not come to change the laws of Moses one bit. Like, he seems to be clear that, Christian Jews should continue to keep the Sabbath and do all the stuff that they used to do. And even seems to imply that that any Gentiles who convert to Christianity are required to keep the Jewish law. Other views, like in Luke, are much more what we call antinomial, as are some of the letters of Paul. The earliest letters being the most antinomial, the later ones being a little more reserved. But where the idea is, these are particularly, in the case of Paul, in the case of the Gospel of Luke, and then Acts, these are in particular people who are interested in converting to Christianity, Gentiles, which already puts them on a side of debate of early Christians about whether Gentiles can be Christians, because the first ones are Jews, and they're like, well, this is for Jews, right? And it says, no, this is a message for non-Jews. And then the question is, okay, well, do they have to become Jews? Do they have to get circumcised? Do they have to keep the Jewish law? And this one said, and these sort of texts take the view of, no, they don't. They typically have the view of, the Jewish laws are fine for the Jews. God gave it to them and they'll continue to do it. But like, Gentiles don't have to do that. And then these are the ones that say, don't, circumcise your heart. You don't have to become circumcised to become a Christian. You just have to become spiritually righteous. And you don't have to follow the rules of these Pharisees, these highly observant Jews who do this and that. That doesn't make them righteous. Better to be a tax collector who asks God for forgiveness than a Pharisee who thinks he's righteous, and doesn't ask God for forgiveness. That kind of
the sin of pride, as Leonard Peikoff's Opar Objectivism book sort of points out, the sin of pride makes the Christian ethics basically unpracticable, because if you're too good of a Christian, you might end up proud. So you're between a rock and a hard place.
Ben Franklin set out to sort of make himself virtuous at one point and practice and see how long it would take him to become morally perfect. He seemed to think he could do this in about a week. Anyway, after a short amount of time, he comes back and he's like, this isn't working out, because the more I improve on these other virtues, the worse I do with respect to humility. So there you go.
Yeah. Okay. So Jesus, he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, however he phrases it, and give to God what is God's. And I would think the Romans have no problem with that. They're like, sure, give us what's ours.
So you get, in the early Christian writings, you get different takes on sort of Rome within Christian texts. So and mainstream scholars know this and have studied it for a long time. And what you find is that often, so it's not that they're typically pro-Roman per se, but they're a heck of a lot less anti-Roman than they are anti-Jewish or anti-non-Christian Jewish at a time when many Christians were Jews. So there's often blame shifting. We might have blamed the Romans for this. It's really the fault of the Jews. Other things like that. Certainly, there's also the fact that, look, if Jesus is the Messiah, so the Mashiach, the Messiah, the anointed, the Christos, was not what we think of now. Christianity completely changed the concept of messianism. What the concept of messianism was, and it really solidified during the reign of the Hasmoneans, the people from the Maccabees who established a Jewish kingdom. After hundreds of years without a Jewish kingdom, they reestablished one, and they were eager to kind of pump that up and so on. And basically the idea of the Mashiach was something like Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. Like, he's the true heir of the king, and he's going to come back and he's going to beat up the bad guy. He'll defeat the armies of Sauron, and then like Gondor will be restored. That was the idea. It's like, he is a true heir to the house of David, and he'll come back. He'll kick out the invaders who are ruling us, and then we will have an autonomous Jewish kingdom ruled by an heir to our greatest king and main lineage of kings. So that's the idea of what the Mashiach is, because in the book of Samuel, right, like Saul and David, like they are anointed with oil by the prophet Samuel, which is the sign that they've been chosen by God to be Israel's human king. So that's the idea, right? So if you think, well, Jesus is the Messiah, he didn't kick out the Romans the way the Maccabees kicked out the Assyrian Greeks, the Seleucids. He got nailed to a cross and died and didn't do shit. That doesn't make sense. Well, then, you say, well, part of it is that he's going to come back in a supernatural way and establish the kingdom of heaven. And when he does, not only will he like reestablish a Jewish kingdom, he will reestablish God's kingdom on earth. So part of it is his first appearance on earth is not the main return of the king. That's not the return of the king when he's just born and around. It's when he comes back. It's not even his resurrection. It's his full return. That's going to happen any day, guys. And from the very beginning, Christians were saying any day now, that's going to happen. And it won't, and yes, he will overthrow the Roman Empire. He will overthrow all kingdoms. And that's something that Paul, for example, says that like nobody could say is pro-Roman. I think that's in Thessalonians. And, like I should say, like that's something that like creating Christ seems to accept this conspiracy theory that Paul was like a Roman agent, and no Roman agent will say that like, hey, Gentiles, here's a Jewish Messiah you should believe in now, and he's going to come and he's going to eventually overthrow the Roman Empire and everything else. Like that doesn't make any sense. So so that's the idea. So now, okay, so I say all this because the idea or the expectation, right, this changes how we think about how a Messiah is thought about in general. And he's no longer an actual like temporal guy who will in real time reestablish politically Judean autonomy and become king from a bloodline. The Gospels have to kind of bend backwards to explain how a guy who everybody knows is from the Galilee is from the house of David. And that's why you get these weird concocted stories about, oh, well, actually the family was originally from Bethlehem, which is the hometown of David's father, Jesse, and that, right? So they have to make these concocted things. So Jesus is still of the line of David somehow, even though that doesn't make sense for some Galilean guy. but all the same, what he's going to accomplish is very, very different. And scholars who think that there was a historical Jesus, which is most mainstream biblical scholars, secular biblical, scholars, academics, they tend to think there was some guy, and he was probably some apocalyptic prophet, some guy who was saying like the ends are coming soon. Perhaps he was saying the Romans would be kicked out. We don't know. And he was crucified during the governorship of Pontius Pilate in Judea. And so, and that's about all we can be reasonably confident was real or happened. There are also Jesus mythicists. Few mainstream scholars are mythicists, but there are a few mythicists. Some of them tend to be kooks and cranks. Some of them, there are a small number who are serious. So like Richard Carrier, who's a classicist originally, not a Bible scholar, is on the more serious side. And they tend to think there was not a historical figure, Jesus. Mm-hmm. Carrier's view is interesting. Carrier's view is that originally there was a divine figure, this sort of part of God or angel who descends to save the world. People started to believe in that. And then it was sort of reverse historicized, and the human part came second. Again, there are problems with that story. There are things that are dubious about it. But he raises interesting questions, at least, about the standards of evidence for the historical Jesus. And I should add, he has some weird Bayesian stuff, which is a little silly sometimes. But on the whole, the reasons mainstream scholars think there's a historical Jesus are a couple. So there are not contemporaneous, that is in the lifetime of Jesus, texts talking about Jesus. There are ones from a generation later in Josephus, and then in the following century, there are Roman sources, Suetonius and Tacitus, that refer to Christians who worship Jesus, who was a Jewish guy who was executed in the time of under Pontius Pilate. And the gospel, and then they look at the gospels. Now, so mainstream scholars, even those, the majority who think there was a historical Jesus, do not think the gospels are historical. That is to say, they do not think the gospels are accurate history in any way. They think that they're written after Jesus. They are not assigned to the names of the evangelists that they are now. So Matthew, Mark, right? So now they're not pseudonymous. There are things like letter from Paul to Seneca, which is a forgery of a correspondence between Paul and the Roman Stoic Seneca. Like that's just a forgery, like a later forgery. The oldest copies of the canonical gospels do not have those names on them at all. They're just like a story of Jesus. Here you go. So it's more likely that people put those labels on them later as they came to associate them with various members of Jesus's disciples who were known by name. In any case, what these scholars do is they look at these gospels and they say, what if you were setting out to make up a guy who was going to be the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah? What wouldn't you do? You wouldn't say he was from Nazareth, which is in the Galilee. That doesn't make sense. And then you would, in fact, look at some of the Gospels and have it kind of bend over backwards to explain that fact. And then you would say, okay, this looks like people who had an inconvenient historical fact that they were trying to explain around by adding made-up story. And so this is sometimes called the principle of embarrassment, where if they kind of reveal something that you wouldn't put in your narrative if you had a choice, but you can't help it because everybody knows about it, then it's more likely to be true. And there are other criteria they use to inform this process, but that's a big one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got only a few minutes left. So the Last Supper, is that Jesus, the Jew, celebrating Passover?
Yeah, that's
basically?
how it's typically understood.
And that,
yeah.
and what's the significance of the Last Supper? Is it that it's the last time he got to do anything before getting arrested and tortured or killed? If you know.
It's the last time he speaks to all his disciples, I believe. And I'm not 100% sure what the full significance of last is, but I think that's right. And it establishes the precedent for the Eucharist, for communion. One of the most important kind of practice of early Christians was that taking special meals together where they symbolically ate the flesh of Jesus and drank his blood. And like pagans who hear secondhand about this are like, are these Christians cannibals? Like, what are they doing? So the Lord's Supper, right? So it is what establishes so it's important in that way. Yeah.
And then Jesus finally died on Good Friday, the ironically named, and then rose from the dead 3 days later, which is Easter. Is that basically it?
Yeah, that's right. And so the Gospels, interestingly, all have very different accounts of how people become notified, or if they become notified of Jesus's resurrection at the kind of mouth of the cave where he's buried, his sepulcher. And they conflict. Like none of the details are the same. Who appears to? How many people are appeared to? Are they appeared to by Jesus per se, or by some other presence? Whether is the door open? Like the details all conflict. When people read the Gospels through, they're like, oh look, they all agree. 3 days later he came back. Like no, like it's
Yeah. Okay. Now, Simon in the super chat asks, does the crucifixion have mythical precedence?
Yeah, I mean, you've got Prometheus chained to the Caucasus Mountains. You've got you have other depictions of gods bound and tortured or killed, but specifically on a crucifix, I don't think so. That's a Roman form of execution, so that might be unique. But
I've heard it said that if you look at the Christian art from the start and onward, Jesus's hands are pointed straight above him, and then with time they move to his sides with each passing generation. Basically, that the cross shape was borrowed from some other myth, other religion or something, and the Christians basically adopted that shape, that symbol. Are you familiar with any of that allegation?
Yeah, I mean, so I believe the way the Romans typically built their crosses was as saltires, like as X's. And so we don't see the cross as a main symbol for Jesus before the 4th century of CE, of the Common Era. And even then, it's still not the main one. The main one is, for a while, so there are two things. There's Christograms, and then there's symbols. And sometimes they're the same thing. So in many early New Testament manuscripts, like the oldest ones, instead of saying Christ or instead of saying Jesus, they'll just be a little symbol. And which had some kind of sacred significance. And so one of them is like kind of the Cairo monogram, which became a symbol in Rome, under Constantine. And that's an X with what looks to us like the letter P, but is the letter Rho for Cairo, so Christ. And there is a possible source of the cross image may have been some of these Christograms that look like that. So the other main early symbol for Christianity is the Ichthus, the fish, and it's just a little, it's like 3/4 of an infinity sign, right, going left to right. And the reason that was a symbol for the Christians is it's not because Titus chose a dolphin and anchor. The reason is because Ichthus is just a monogram. It's not a monogram. It's an like scuba, an acronym. It's an acronym that fits a word that was already a mainstream Greek word. Ichthus is the Greek word for fish, but it was also convenient acronym. Jesus Christi, Theos Soter. So Jesus Christ, Son of God's Son, Savior. And perhaps it was just a very simple symbol for people who were, a lot of the early Christians were sort of poor and not the elite. And so it was convenient. So that was the deal with that.
Okay. We are out of time. I guess if you could answer this as quickly as possible, is the bunny and the eggs, is that basically just pagan stuff that the Christians appropriated?
Well, eggs are part of the Passover Seder as well.
Right. Okay.
And I do not know where the rabbit comes from.
All right. Well, that's always going to be a mystery, just like the question Ali G asks in the Ali G show of a Christian on the panel. He says, does Jesus really exist, or is it just your father dressed up? That's another question we won't get to today. But coming up today at 7 p.m. UK time, which is in just a couple minutes, it's Finance Friday with Jim Brown on inflation update. It's all about the money. That's what the episode is called. Then after that, at 8 p.m. UK time, it's James Valiant with Robert and Amy Nasser discussing Leonard Peikoff's essay, Abortion Rights Are Pro-Life. Thanks, Jason. This was a wonderful and educational conversation. Looking forward to speaking again.
Cheers.
Happy Easter and goodbye.